Steam billowed from the train doors as they groaned open, curling into the cold Mississippi air like a signal that the world these men knew was ending and another was about to begin. The scent hit them first, not the metallic hunger of ration tins or the sourness of weeks-old shipboard bread, but something warm, almost sweet, drifting from somewhere beyond the barbed wire. Even before their boots touched the platform, several German generals exchanged wary glances, unsure whether this unexpected fragrance was real or simply another trick of exhaustion. They had crossed an ocean in silence, surrounded by guards who rarely spoke unless necessary, and they had convinced themselves they were being delivered into a harsher chapter of captivity. For men trained to read battlefields with clinical precision, the unknown was always the most dangerous enemy, and Camp Clinton felt, in these first seconds, like a place designed to unnerve them without firing a shot. The oldest among them, a gaunt figure in his late 50s, stepped down with deliberate rigidity, determined not to reveal how weak the journey had left him. His overcoat hung from his shoulders like it belonged to a stronger version of the man he used to be. Beside him, a slightly younger officer scanned the camp with narrowed eyes, habit, not defiance, mapping escape routes he knew he'd never attempt. And at the rear, a Luftwaffe colonel in his early 30s hesitated at the top step, as if the air itself carried a meaning he couldn't yet decipher. They had prepared themselves for hostility, for thin rations, for the humiliation they assumed victors would relish. Yet as the guards motioned them forward with routine professionalism, not malice, the first crack formed in the wall of certainty they'd spent years constructing. Snow had dusted the ground overnight, leaving the camp washed in a pale stillness. Wooden barracks lined the interior like a small military village, functional, guarded, but nothing resembling the brutal imprisonment their imaginations had promised. In Germany, they'd heard stories of how captured officers were supposedly starved, beaten, denied dignity. Propaganda thrives most easily when no evidence challenges it. And for months they had consumed those narratives as faithfully as they consumed ersatz bread padded with cellulose fillers. Hunger and ideology often twist the same knife, and by late 1944, both had carved deeply into the German officer corps. But here, as they marched between the guard towers, no one jeered, no one shoved them, no one reminded them of the nation they had failed to defend. The absence of cruelty was almost more unsettling than cruelty itself. A door creaked open to their right, and a wave of warm air rolled outward, laden with aromas so vivid their stomachs clenched before their minds could process them. Bread, real bread, fresh enough that its crust must have crackled moments earlier. Butter melting somewhere on cast iron pans. Something meaty simmering, releasing a slow, rich fragrance that belonged to a world before shortages, before war had turned kitchens into laboratories for survival. The oldest general stopped mid-step. His breath hitched, just enough for the younger men to notice. They said nothing, but each felt the same jolt of disbelief. For a moment, their ranks dissolved, replaced by something simpler. Men who had not eaten a truly satisfying meal in months. Their escorts guided them toward the mess hall. A low murmur of American voices drifted through the walls. Cooks giving instructions, utensils clattering, coffee percolating. The Luftwaffe colonel swallowed hard. Back home, genuine coffee had vanished from officers' tables long ago, replaced by roasted barley, chicory, or whatever could be ground fine enough to mimic the real thing. He had forgotten what coffee smelled like until this moment. Now it wrapped around him like a memory of a life interrupted. One of the guards opened the door fully, and the scene inside was almost too ordinary to believe. Long wooden tables, rows of metal trays, young American cooks, sleeves rolled up, working through their routine without so much as a glance of triumph toward the new arrivals. They weren't gloating. They weren't grandstanding. They were simply preparing breakfast for prisoners of war as if it were no different than cooking for their own units. The generals hesitated at the threshold, caught between pride and an involuntary, aching need to sit down after weeks of travel. Pride tugged first. Hunger tore harder. As they stepped inside, they noticed the details that would stay with them for years. Food served in portions larger than many soldiers saw during the last months of the Eastern Front. Steam rising in gentle curls. The faint hiss of butter meeting a hot pan, and trays of bread so golden they seemed impossible under wartime rationing. One officer muttered under his breath, stunned, "We're Dacton. Yes, we're Sagemal brought. We thought it would be sawdust bread." Another exhaled shakily, unwilling to let his emotions show, but powerless to stop them from gathering just behind his eyes. The guards gestured for them to take seats. The benches felt almost luxurious after the cramped train compartments. Across the table, the oldest general finally allowed himself a closer look at the meal being prepared for them. Each item contradicted everything he believed he understood about the enemy. If America could feed its prisoners this well, what did it feed its soldiers? What did it feed its civilians? And more dangerously, what did it feed the future? A wave of shame mingled with relief as he realized his own troops back home might never again taste such abundance. He tightened his jaw when a cook set a tray before him, but his hands betrayed him, trembling despite every effort to steady them. Hunger alone could not explain it. Something deeper had shifted, something tied to a lifetime of certainty unraveling in the presence of something as simple as bread. The Luftwaffe colonel watched him carefully, sensing a transformation neither of them had words for yet. War shapes men in ways battles cannot explain. Captivity sometimes reveals the truth those battles try to hide. For a long moment, none of them lifted a fork. Pride hung in the air like a final commandment. But pride cannot be eaten, and hunger is an enemy indifferent to ideology. Slowly, as if surrendering to a truth rather than to a nation, the oldest general reached forward. The bread yielded beneath his fingers, soft, warm, unmistakably real. He whispered something. No one caught the words, but the look in his eyes said enough. Whatever war they had imagined awaited them here, this was not it. And yet, beneath the warmth of the meal and the quiet professionalism of the guards, a question lingered like a shadow. If America could treat its enemies with such abundance, what did that reveal about the world they had fought against, and about the world that awaited them beyond these walls? Steam still drifted through the mess hall as the generals took their seats, but now it mingled with an uncomfortable quiet, an almost sacred stillness that none of them dared to break. The meal before them felt less like nourishment and more like a confrontation, a mirror held up to everything they had believed about the world beyond their borders. For years they had been told that America was decadent, disorganized, a nation of excess incapable of discipline. Yet here they were, staring at eggs folded with impossible softness, stew rich enough to perfume the entire room, and bread that glowed with a warmth no ersatz recipe had ever produced. It was the kind of food that made a man remember what normal life used to feel like. And for soldiers who had watched a continent grind itself into dust, that memory hurt more than hunger ever had. The older general lifted his fork slowly, as if testing whether gravity still obeyed him. His hand trembled, the muscles used to stillness after months of tension and travel. He brought a small piece of bread to his lips, and something inside him cracked. Not audibly, not visibly, but with the private severity of a soldier realizing the world had outgrown the certainties he once commanded. He chewed with deliberate restraint, trying to maintain the armor of rank, but the taste overwhelmed him. Real grain, real yeast, real crust. No chalky fillers, no bitter substitutes, none of the survival tricks baked into German kitchens during the final years of the war. He blinked hard and set the bread down, staring at it as if trying to reconcile a truth he had never expected to face in captivity. Across the table, the younger Luftwaffe officer watched him, torn between curiosity and the faint ache of recognizing the same battle inside himself. He had grown up hearing that the enemy was fragile, unprepared for hardship, untested by history. Yet the food told another story, a nation that could afford generosity even in wartime, a nation whose strength did not depend on squeezing its last resources dry. The officer tasted the stew, letting the broth settle on his tongue. It carried a depth of flavor so foreign to him now that he almost laughed, but the sound escaped instead as a choked breath. Hunger had shaped his life for too long to ignore what this meant. The middle-aged general, still holding his posture like a man carved from parade ground granite, was the last to eat. He traced a finger along the rim of the metal tray, his expression rigid. To him, food had always been strategic, a resource to ration, a weapon when scarce, a liability when lost. But here in this hall, it became something more unsettling, evidence. He finally scooped a portion of eggs, and the fork clicked faintly against his teeth. He paused, eyes narrowing, the subtle shift in his face revealing a realization he could not stop. This was not a display staged to humiliate them. The Americans were not performing kindness. They were simply feeding prisoners according to regulations. and the ease with which they could do so revealed more about industrial capacity than any captured intelligence report ever could. A young American cook passed behind them, carrying another tray to the counter. He gave no special attention to the officers, no smug grin or victorious swagger. His indifference, strangely, cut deeper than hostility might have. To the generals, the absence of hatred suggested confidence. An economy so secure, a supply chain so robust, that even high-ranking enemy officers did not warrant emotional waste. This, perhaps more than the meal itself, unsettled them. Nations fighting for survival ration every gesture along with their food. Nations fighting from abundance can afford restraint. The older general wiped the corner of his eye with a motion so subtle it might have been a simple adjustment of his sleeve. The younger officers politely pretended not to see, but the moment lingered between them. Hunger alone did not drive that reaction. Men do not break from taste alone. What broke inside him was the realization that he had spent years defending a system that could no longer even feed its civilians, much less its armies. And here, across an ocean, the enemy treated its prisoners with the same calm efficiency it used to feed millions at home. He leaned forward, voice low enough to barely carry across the table. "If this is captivity," he murmured, "then what does freedom look like in this country?" Neither of the younger men answered, but their silence acknowledged the weight of the question. They ate more slowly now, each bite an admission that they had entered a world operating on rules far different from the ones they knew. The meal progressed quietly, interrupted only by the soft scrape of utensils and the hum of kitchen work behind them. There were no speeches from officers, no declarations of moral victory or defiance. Instead, the room filled with the soft, unsteady breathing of men confronting a truth too large to articulate, that the enemy they had been trained to resent might rebuild their homeland more kindly than their own government ever had. It was a thought none dared express openly, but the seed took root all the same. The Luftwaffe officer ran a thumb along the edge of his tray and felt a strange mix of gratitude and humiliation. Gratitude because the meal gave him a momentary glimpse of what life after war might feel like. Humiliation because he understood now that America's strength wasn't simply industrial. It was cultural, economic, even moral in its adherence to rules during victory. For a nation raised on the mythology of its own superiority, that was a more devastating blow than any battlefield defeat. When the guards eventually motioned for them to rise, none of the generals moved immediately. They lingered, absorbing the final traces of warmth from the plates, as if trying to memorize the moment before reality reshaped itself once again. The older general stood first, slower than before, as though weighed down by a realization too heavy for his rank to shield him from. The others followed, stepping back into the cold air with expressions tightened not by fear, but by comprehension. Behind them, the mess hall door closed with a soft thud. Yet its echo carried an unmistakable message. The war they knew had ended, and a different war, the war inside themselves, had begun. Snowmelt dripped from the barack roofs like a slow metronome as dawn crept over Camp Clinton, revealing a world that felt strangely suspended between war and something quieter. The generals stepped out into the cold morning light with the cautious poise of men expecting the illusion to break. The previous day's meal had unsettled them more deeply than they admitted, and now the camp itself seemed intent on widening that fracture. Sunlight slid across rows of neatly built wooden barracks, the geometry precise enough to resemble a military village rather than a prison. The guards moved with unhurried discipline, rifles slung across their shoulders not as threats, but as reminders of an order that didn't need a shout. To the officers, it felt like walking through a contradiction, captivity that lacked cruelty, control that needed no spectacle, a victory so sure of itself it didn't bother to announce it. The older general inhaled slowly, letting the crisp Mississippi air sharpen his senses. He had spent years analyzing enemy movements, preparing for offensives, learning to predict chaos by watching the smallest details. Yet nothing in his training prepared him for a place where the enemy demonstrated strength through calm routines rather than shows of dominance. He noticed how the guards exchanged casual greetings, how the camp staff performed their duties with quiet confidence, how even the prisoners who had arrived months earlier walked with a surprising sense of certainty. It was as if war existed somewhere far beyond the fence line, unable to penetrate this insulated pocket of American order. As they approached the administrative building for orientation, The middle-aged general studied the camp's layout with the instinct of a man who had once designed defensive positions. The placement of the towers, the fencing reinforced with smooth efficiency, the barracks built with uniform spacing. All of it hinted at meticulous planning. But what struck him most was not the security. It was the visible abundance. The neatly stacked lumber near the workshops, the well-maintained vehicles, the stock supply sheds. Even small details, like the fresh paint on a door frame or the new glass in a window, revealed a country that had resources to spare even while fighting a global war. Germany, by the final months of 1944, could barely keep its factories lit. A young American corporal led them inside, offering instructions with a professionalism so even-toned it felt almost cordial. The older general observed him carefully, waiting for condescension or triumph, but none appeared. Instead, the corporal handed them leaflets outlining camp regulations, meal schedules, and available activities. Activities, an almost absurd word in a world collapsing across the Atlantic. Lectures, crafts, a library, even an orchestra formed by earlier prisoners. The Luftwaffe officer raised an eyebrow at the list, unsure whether to laugh or study it. He had arrived expecting interrogation rooms, not reading rooms. When they entered the library later that afternoon, a warmth different from the mess hall embraced them. Shelves lined the walls, filled with American novels, translated classics, technical manuals, and, most surprising of all, newspapers from around the country. A guard explained that the papers were monitored but not censored beyond removing sensitive military details. The younger officer flipped through a recent edition, astonished to see articles about crop yields, factory expansions, sports scores, and political debates. Not the propaganda-laden triumphs and denials he was accustomed to. America, even in wartime, seemed to carry on with an unbroken rhythm of civilian life. The contrast stung him more deeply than he expected. The older general took a seat near the window where sunlight painted thin stripes across the floor. He opened a technical farming journal, something he hadn't seen in years, and found articles about innovations in machinery, irrigation, and crop science. Even farming here looked like a well-oiled machine, far different from the shortages and requisitions tearing through Europe. Every page reinforced a truth that the meal had only introduced. America's power did not rely solely on weapons. It came from a society capable of feeding itself, organizing itself, and believing in its own future even during global conflict. Later, outside in the yard, the generals watched prisoners from earlier transports engage in work assignments. Some were repairing fences, others tending gardens, others painting new housing units. None looked starved or mistreated. They worked because regulations required it, but also because the rhythm of labor offered purpose in captivity. A guard explained that the work allowed them to earn small wages usable in the camp canteen. The Luftwaffe officer's expression tightened at the notion. Prisoners earning wages inside an enemy camp was something unimaginable in the Reich. And yet here it was, accepted with bureaucratic simplicity. As they continued walking, a train rumbled past the distant edge of the camp, loaded with crates marked for various army depots. The sound carried across the yard, a deep mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate through the officer's ribs. The older general stopped and listened. Supply trains in Germany had become symbols of desperation, carrying fuel scraped from dwindling reserves, ammunition rationed tighter each month, soldiers too young or too wounded to truly serve. But this train sounded different. It was steady, confident, carrying not desperation but capacity. The contrast weighed heavily on him. The Americans weren't displaying power for intimidation. They were simply living within a system that produced power as its natural output. That evening, after another meal that tasted more like a reminder of the world they had lost than a privilege they deserved, the officers gathered briefly in the barracks. The mood had shifted. The younger man spoke first, quietly admitting that he felt disoriented, not by captivity, but by the realization that everything he had been taught about America no longer aligned with what he observed. The middle-aged general added that battles were fought with weapons, but nations were judged by what they could build and sustain under pressure. And here, in this camp thousands of miles from the front, America revealed itself without firing a single shot. The older general remained silent the longest, his hands folded as though weighing a verdict. He finally spoke with a voice softer than either officer had ever heard from him. He said that if Germany survived the war, it would have to learn from what he witnessed that day. A nation's strength was not merely its ability to destroy, but its ability to endure, produce, and provide. As he finished, he glanced toward the window where the night sky hung deep and unbothered by the world's conflict. The silence that followed felt like an acknowledgement that their understanding of the war had shifted permanently. But as the lights dimmed and the camp settled into its steady nighttime hum, a new question settled heavily among them. One none dared voice aloud. If America could demonstrate such strength in a prison camp, what did that mean for the Germany they would eventually return to, and for the role men like them would play in rebuilding a nation they no longer fully recognized? The train that carried them back across the Rhine rattled like an old memory refusing to settle, its wooden compartments filled with a silence heavier than the luggage they did not bring. They had left America months earlier with full stomachs, clean uniforms, and a strange, disorienting sense of having glimpsed a world untouched by the chaos they had helped create. Now, as the wheels clattered over scorched tracks and broken bridges patched with temporary steel, the three generals stared through soot-smudged windows at a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had defended. The older general gripped the edge of his seat as if bracing against impact, his breath tightening when he saw the first stretch of ruined farmland. Fields once green, now cratered, barns charred to skeletal frames. It struck him not as defeat, but as something deeper, a truth that had been waiting for them long before captivity. The younger Luftwaffe officer leaned forward when the train slowed near a city, though city felt generous for the expanse of rubble that appeared. Cologne's skyline, once crowned with spires, was a jagged silhouette of broken stone. Columns of civilians moved through the ruins like ghosts in search of past lives. A woman dragged a pram filled not with a child but with firewood. A boy stood in water pouring from a burst pipe, filling jars with a seriousness far older than his age should allow. The officer had prepared himself for destruction, but the quietness of it, no sirens, no smoke rising, no soldiers marching, was more unsettling than the war's noise ever was. It looked like a country holding its breath, uncertain whether to inhale again. When the generals stepped off the train, the air smelled of dust, coal ash, and something faintly metallic. Not bread, not coffee, nothing that reminded them of the abundance they had witnessed across the Atlantic. The station platform was cracked, littered with debris yet strangely organized, marked by wooden signs hand-painted by civilians to direct refugees pouring in from every direction. The middle-aged general noticed a line of Red Cross volunteers distributing thin slices of rye and watery soup. Civilians received them with murmured gratitude, their cheeks sunken, coats patched again and again until barely any of the original fabric remained. He watched quietly, remembering the trays of warm food set before him in Mississippi, the ease with which cooks had ladled out portions without weighing each calorie. The incongruity lodged itself inside him like a shard. A woman approached the older general cautiously, asking whether any trains still ran to Bremen. Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried exhaustion that no rank could ignore. He answered gently that he did not know. She thanked him anyway and walked on, determination holding her upright across his shoulders. Captivity had been structured, predictable, even humane. Freedom, in this devastated landscape, felt far more perilous. Yet he also sensed something he hadn't expected, the faint stirring of purpose. That evening they walked together to a temporary shelter arranged in an undamaged schoolhouse. Children's drawings still clung to some of the walls. Faded suns, clumsy flowers, chalk lines of laughter that had once filled the rooms. Now cots lined the floor. An elderly woman offered them blankets with a tired smile. She did not ask their ranks, did not care about medals or insignia, only that they looked as worn as anyone else who had survived. The middle-aged general felt an ache beneath his ribs. He accepted the blanket with a quiet thank you, humbled by a generosity that cost her far more than the food served in Mississippi had cost the Americans. As night settled, a hush fell over the hall, broken only by distant footsteps and the crackle of a single stove. The older general sat near the window, gazing into darkness where his city once stood. He thought of the library in Camp Clinton, the books on agriculture, industry, and governance he had studied out of habit at first, then out of awe. He thought of the guards who treated them with a professionalism that made cruelty feel obsolete. And he thought of the bread, the absurd, painful symbol of a world his country had failed to build. The younger officer approached, sitting beside him without speaking. After a long moment, he admitted softly that he no longer feared America's power. He feared Germany's inability to understand what truly made a nation strong, despite everything working to pull her down. As he watched her disappear into the crowd, a realization pressed into him with undeniable force. This was the Germany that had been hidden behind reports, slogans, and speeches. The war had not simply ended. It had hollowed the nation from the inside out. The three men walked through the streets in silence, trying to disguise the shock threatening to betray their composure. Brick dust clung to their boots. Windows gaped open with no glass left to shatter. Children played among ruins because there was nowhere else to gather. An old man sat outside what had once been a bakery, its sign still faintly legible beneath layers of soot. He swept the entrance each morning out of habit, though there had been no flour inside for months. The younger officer felt his throat tighten. In America, even prisoners had eaten better than civilians here. The cruelty of that contrast sank into him like a confession. As they continued walking, the older general paused near a collapsed bridge where workers were attempting to build a makeshift crossing. Their movements were slow, deliberate, careful with the few materials they had. A British officer overseeing reconstruction nodded respectfully when he saw the Germans observing, offering a brief greeting without hostility. The older general returned the nod, startled by the civility. He realized then that the world was moving on, not forgiving, not forgetting, but rebuilding, and that Germany would need to decide whether to rise alongside it or remain buried beneath the ruins. Later, in what remained of a community hall, the generals were processed by local authorities and informed of their release terms. They were free to return to their families. If their families were still alive, if their homes still stood, if they could find fuel or transport. The Luftwaffe officer folded the papers handed to him and felt the weight of responsibility settle. The older general nodded, eyes glistening. Strength, he murmured, is not in the uniform or the command. It is in the capacity to provide, even in hardship. Outside, the night winds carried the scent of dust and distant fires. Inside, the three generals lay awake, each grappling with the same quiet, unspoken truth. The meal that had broken the war inside them was not simply an act of generosity. It was a revelation, a vision of what Germany could become, if it chose to rise from the ruins with humility rather than pride. And as dawn approached, bringing with it the first pale wash of light over shattered rooftops, each man understood with unmistakable clarity that returning home was not the end of their captivity. It was the beginning of a responsibility far heavier than any rank they had carried into the war.